Hello, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me tonight. My name is Mac Smith, and I want to thank Gina for her assistance in setting this up. She's been very professional and very patient from start to finish. And I want to thank the good people of the Penobscot Marine Museum for this invitation. I'm Mac Smith. I'm a neighbor to the museum. I live in the next town over, Stockton Springs. And I'm thrilled to be speaking for the museum at the museum tonight, virtually. And I'm here to talk about my book, Mainers on the Titanic. We all know the story of Titanic now, but things were different 100 plus years ago after Titanic sank. Directly after she sank, the first headlines in the Maine newspapers were quite misleading. The Portland Evening Express, the headline read that the Titanic was being towed to Halifax and all passengers were safe. The Lewiston Evening Journal's headline was all passengers on Titanic saved. What I'm going to do, I'm going to discuss each of the people or parties from Maine, of Maine, who were aboard Titanic. And as I do, I'm going to tell the story of Titanic herself. And we're going to start with Helen Churchill Candy, who was a divorced author from York, Maine, who was in her late 50s, early 60s. She was sailing back to America on Titanic because her son had just been involved in an airplane accident, which was quite rare because airplanes had really just been invented. On board Titanic, she meets Edward A. Kent, a prominent architect from Bangor. Mr. Kent was sailing back to America on Titanic to begin his retirement. Now, together, these two form the core of a group of people, and through them, we see what daily life was like on Titanic. And we get to the night that Titanic hits the iceberg. This group has been out kind of late. It's getting unusually cold. It's Sunday night, and it's past 11 p.m. Mrs. Candy is escorted back to her cabin, and she requests that a hot bath be drawn for her because it's so cold. And she's in her cabin holding on to her post when Titanic hits. There's a post in her room that she's holding on to, and Titanic hits the iceberg. And she said if she hadn't been holding on to that post, she would have been thrown to the floor and very badly injured. Now, the first people that escaped Titanic have a pretty good experience. It takes us to the family of Henry Sleeper Harper, his wife Myra. They were very rich people. They actually owned an island in Frenchman Bay down off Mount Desert Island. It was called Turtle Island. They were some of the first people to escape, and the entire party escaped. Mr. Harper, Mrs. Harper, Mr. Harper's manservant, and the Harper's two small dogs. The next group to have a good experience is the Spedden family of Winter Harbor. It's Daisy and Frederick Spedden and their one child, Douglas, who's 6 years old. They have a charmed experience on Titanic, relatively speaking. They go directly to a lifeboat. They're launched without problem. They're plucked from the sea without problem. But 3 years later, fate would come find the Spedden family down in Winter Harbor and extract a toll from them, as happened with many of the survivors of Titanic from Maine. And then there was William Sloper, who was a sportsman from Greenville. And Mr. Sloper had a good experience. He got off on a lifeboat pretty easily, no problems. And when he gets back to New York, he has enough money to rent a hotel room. The next morning, he opens the New York Sun, one of the leading newspapers, a William Randolph Hearst newspaper, And one of the headlines on the front page is that Mr. Sloper escaped from Titanic dressed as a woman. Now, the mood on Titanic starts to change now. Things have been kind of calm, but now they start to get strange. They're still not bad, but they're strange. It brings us to the Allison family. The Allisons themselves were not from Maine, but they had family in Old Orchard Beach, and the family story comes full circle down there about 8 years after Titanic, about 20 years after Titanic sinks. There was Mr. and Mrs. Allison, their 3-year-old daughter Lorraine, and their 1-year-old son Trevor. Mr. and Mrs. Allison were in their cabin sleeping with Lorraine when the Titanic hit the iceberg. Trevor was in a cabin across the hall with the nanny. The nanny grabbed Trevor, pounded on Mr. and Mrs. Allison's door, and they told her to go back to bed because there was no trouble. And she didn't. She goes up on deck and she's off on one of the first lifeboats with Trevor. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Allison, once they realize how much trouble Titanic is in, they grab Lorraine and head to the deck, and they search for the nanny and for Trevor. And Mrs. Allison refuses to leave Titanic until she can find her son, who by now is about a quarter of a mile away from Titanic, safely in a lifeboat. Mrs. Allison eventually faints on deck. She has to be carried into an inside room. And that's symbolic of just some of the odd happenings. And then things start to turn very bad. It takes us to 2 p.m. It's about 2 a.m. in the morning, I should say. It's about 20 minutes before Titanic sinks. And it takes us to the Millionaire's Lifeboat. Now, this lifeboat was supposed to be the first one launched, but it ends up being the last one launched. And amongst the millionaires in this boat are 4 families who are very prominent in the summer colony down in Bar Harbor. And this was a time when those summer colonists would spend up to 6 months a year here in Maine. The people of Bar Harbor became their friends, their neighbors, their employees. They became part of the family. Now, very quickly, the families represented, there was the Ryerson family. Mr. Ryerson was a founding member of the Mount Desert Reading Room, where one could get a drink during Prohibition down in Bar Harbor. There was the Widener family, prominent Philadelphia family. Their daughter Eleanor would marry a man named Fitzhugh Dixon. Eleanor Widener Dixon would give enough money to build a clinic in Gouldsboro, the Eleanor Widener Dixon Clinic. They've been very generous with Maine Coast Memorial Hospital. The Thayer family, also from Philadelphia. And then lastly, the Astors. And this is Colonel John Jacob Astor, who's in his early 40s, and his new wife, Madeline, who's about 18 years old. Their love affair began in Bar Harbor. Colonel Astor was recently divorced. Madeline's playing on the tennis court and catches his eye, and their romance is scandalous to the extent that no minister in the United States would perform their wedding ceremony. They had to finally pay a minister $1,000 or donate, and had it done, but it was quite scandalous at the time. Now, the way things worked at this point in history, these millionaires in first class generally followed a specific captain. And in this case, these people followed Captain Smith. That's why he was put specifically on Titanic's maiden voyage. He was due to retire soon. This group of millionaires were ushered personally down a crew-only bridge down to A deck, the next deck down from the topmost deck. And a lifeboat was lowered down for them, specially. Now, what happens is Titanic had been changed a little bit from the last ship built by the White Star Line. The Titanic on the A deck had large rectangular windows like the last ship, but they had found that the sea spray was coming in those windows and splashing the first class passengers. So they'd put glass in these windows, and they needed a special instrument to open the glass so the people could get into this lifeboat. So while that's happening, the crew goes back, they start loading other lifeboats. By the time they get back to this foremost lifeboat on the port side, number 4, it's 2 o'clock in the morning and the ship's just about sunk. Now, by now, the ship has a severe list to the port, so the crew has to pull this lifeboat with long rods back to the side of Titanic. They rig up some deck chairs and try to get the women in. And finally, the crew has to grab the women by their arms and their legs and just swing them in. And they start tossing children and babies in that lifeboat that way too. Now, this lifeboat should have had gone 70 feet from the top of Titanic down to the water. By now, she only had to go 20 feet because the Titanic was so low in the water. It hits the water and is untied, but by now, people on the ship are throwing anything they can find into the water because now there are people in the water. So deck chairs, barrels, they're dodging all these things in this little lifeboat. And there are very few crew members in the lifeboat. So all of these very rich society women who have generally never had to do a lot for themselves now had to save their own lives. And they did. And the most effective person in this group is young Madeline Astor, who's about 18 years old. And they get away from Titanic to safety. And then Madeline Astor stands up and insists that that boat goes back. And this lifeboat filled with these millionaires is one of 2 that go back and pull people out of the water. The rest refuse to do so. Now, of course, Titanic sinks, and there's a woman named Dr. Alice Leader. She's a prominent physician from Lewiston, and this is her account of after the sinking. No one can realize the agony of those minutes when the screams and cries for succor from those who had been swept from the decks into the sea were borne to our ears by the ice-cold breeze of the night, said Dr. Leader. Never so long as the good God permits me to live will I ever forget those cries. And soon the cries stop. And she says, as the prayers and screams for help ceased, we all knew what it meant. And soon everybody in her lifeboat was saying a prayer. Now, the story of Titanic can sort of stop at the sinking, but now we have 17 lifeboats on the open ocean in the freezing cold water. Some of them are way overfilled with people that have just seen their entire families lost. And it's a very dramatic time. It wouldn't take much to upset one of these lifeboats. Now, on the water in one of the lifeboats is a woman named Clara Hayes of Portland. She's with her daughter, Orion. Clara's husband, Charles Melville Hayes, was very prominent in Portland in the 1900s, the early 1900s. He was president of the Grand Trunk Railroad, very prominent in Portland, very prominent across the United States and in Canada. Mr. Hayes was going to retire as soon as he got back to America. They had built a retirement home on Cushing Island, right off the coast of Portland. And none of them in their party thought the ship was going to sink. Orion, Charles' daughter, said afterwards that they didn't even think to give him a kiss goodbye. And all through the night in these lifeboats on this open ocean, Clara Hayes continually calls out, Charles Hayes, are you there? And she never gets the answer she's looking for. Now, one of these lifeboats actually wasn't launched. It sort of fell off the deck when the Titanic sank, and it was upside down. And on top was assembled 27 men and women, 26 men, one woman. And they cling to this lifeboat for their life. And they're doing okay, but in a few hours, the sun starts to come up. And as it does, the sea, which has been calm throughout all this, starts to churn. And every time a good wave comes along, it lifts the lifeboat up just enough to lose a little air. So it sinks lower and lower and lower. Now, these people have to save their own lives because no one's coming back for them. They end up standing up on this lifeboat, which has a curved bottom. It's wet, it's probably icy, and they form two single file lines. And they all stand there with their hands on the shoulders of the person in front of them. And the person in the front of each of these lines, when a wave would come, they'd call out orders of how the line of people was supposed to move to mitigate the effects of that wave so they could conserve that air until finally at last a lifeboat did come back for them eventually. Now what happens is the sun rises and Carpathia shows up, the one rescue ship to make it in time. And on board is a young woman named Eleanor Danforth of Gardner, Maine. She witnesses this rescue firsthand. And the rescue was done with a military-like precision. There's a rope ladder for able-bodied men to climb up along the side of the Carpathia. The women are put into a rope chair, which is tied to another rope, and the crew pulls them up very quickly. Then lastly, the babies and small children are put into empty canvas postal bags. The bag would be lowered down on a rope, the child put in, the rope cinched up on the bag, and then the other rope pulled up, and the child would be plucked up like that. And they were pulling them out left and right. And as soon as everybody would arrive on Carpathia, they quickly ascertained what class passenger were you, and first, second, and third class passengers were all sent to different decks and treated by different doctors, just like it had been on Titanic. That was a hard and fast rule, apparently. Now, what happens is Titanic sinks very early Monday morning. Very late Thursday evening, the Carpathia, the rescue ship, comes into New York City with all the survivors. Waiting on the pier is J.P. Morgan, a prominent Northeast Harbor summer resident. Mr. Morgan basically owned Titanic. He would die almost a year to the day later after Titanic sank, and he was a villain in the eyes of the press and the world. And he had lost a lot of friends actually on Titanic. Also waiting at the pier is the family of Richard and Percival White. Now, that Percival is the father, Richard is the son, and they're from Brunswick, Maine. Richard had been a student at Bowdoin College. Richard was a very serious young man, and he had dedicated all his time to his studies. And by doing so, he actually completed his schoolwork in December 1911. He was due to graduate from Bowdoin in June, 2 months after Titanic sank. Now, because he had worked so hard, his father wanted to give him a special reward, and that reward was a ticket aboard Titanic. The two last people I'm going to talk about are sort of the reason I wrote the book. Their story gets lost to history. One is Reverend Charles Leonard Kirkland of the Bangor Old Town area. Reverend Kirkland was a Baptist minister, but he had no specific church that he was in charge of. He would fill in where he was needed. He had been in Scotland taking care of some family business, and he was a second-class passenger on Titanic. Now, what happened was he had 6 adult children back here in Maine, and they knew their father would be home in time for Easter, but they didn't know what ship he was going to sail on. Now, in that 3 days from the time of the sinking until Carpathia arrives, nobody quite knew all the details of the sinking. So all the newspapers across the country published the passenger list. What happens is one of Reverend Kirkland's children happens to open up the Old Town Enterprise, and they see their father's name on the passenger list. And as the survivor list is being wired in, it's published in the local papers, and his name's not on the survivor list. That's how they found out their father had passed. Then lastly was a man named Victor Verescu, Verequuesse. He was a worker at a woolen mill in Vassalboro. His family similarly found out he was on Titanic by reading the passenger list and not finding his name in the survivor list. And that's actually all I know about that particular person, because his story is being lost to time. I talk about a bunch of different things, Titanic related and Maine related, in this book. But some of the most interesting stories is in what happened to these survivors afterwards. And fate seemed to find these people one way or the other. It just took a little more time for some of them. And the one person, there's stories about most everybody I've just discussed, but I'm just going to briefly discuss Madeline Astor, who I said was 18 years old at the time of the sinking. Her marriage to Colonel Astor had been very scandalous. He was lost on Titanic, and she was 5 months pregnant when Titanic sank. And she knew that she was coming home to the same press coverage, the same lack of privacy, the same invasion of privacy this young woman had suffered before sailing on Titanic. And what happens is, the big question in Maine and across the country, is she coming back to Bar Harbor? It was very important to Bar Harbor to have an Astor there. They were competing hard with Newport at the time. And Madeline was sort of part of the family. So we kind of wanted to see her back, I think. And she doesn't come back the first summer, but the next 3 summers, she does come back to Bar Harbor, but she lives a very quiet life until the last summer she's here. Then she's out everywhere, it seems like. She's part of a Red Cross war relief effort. She sews bandages and war relief items. She's very socially active, kind of controversial in some of the guests that she has at her summer cottage in Bar Harbor. But the very last year she comes back, 1916, she shows up, and it turns out she's secretly engaged. And she's engaged to a childhood sweetheart from Brooklyn, and they plan to get married secretly and then go off on their honeymoon. But when she gets here, she finds out a new Maine law makes it, she has to have a 3-day waiting period because she's a non-resident. And by now, the cat's out of the bag that she's getting remarried. And everybody wants to see this, and she had wanted privacy is all. So finally, the day of the ceremony comes, and Madeline and her fiance make their way to St. Saviour's Church, right in the center of Bar Harbor, a beautiful old church that's still there. And they go in, very small wedding party. It's a very simple ceremony. And there's a huge crowd outside. Now, one reason, other than she's Madeline Astor and they just want to see her, there's another reason there's such a big crowd. Under the terms of Colonel Astor's will, he left Madeline most everything except for the bulk of the money, but he had left her with a $5 million trust fund, and that's $5 million in 1912 money. And use of the mansions, everything. But there was a stipulation in that will. If Madeline was to remarry, she forfeited everything. The $5 million trust, the use of everything Astor, including the Astor name. And at this time, being queen of society was hugely important. So this crowd wants to get a glimpse of this woman who's giving up Astor for true love, for a childhood sweetheart. So what happens is after a few minutes, the ceremony's done inside the church. A groomsman and a bridesmaid come out the front door. This crowd of hundreds of people surge to that front door because they're about to get a glimpse of Madeline. Madeline is a very sharp tack. What she does when the bride and groomsmen come out the front and draw that crowd, she and her new husband sneak out the back, hop in their nice automobile. They head down Kennebec Avenue, take a left, and just hightail it to Ellsworth so they can get on a train and get to their honeymoon and get some kind of privacy out of this mess that seemed to be Madeline Astor's life. There's a whole story there. And basically, I'm going to wrap it up and then ask if there are any questions, but I just want to let you know Mainers on the Titanic is just one of 5 books that I have through Down East Books. There's Peyton Place Comes Home to Maine, the making of the iconic film. A lot of good Searsport history in there. And good mid-coast history, of course. Maine's Hail to the Chief, a history of presidential visits to the Pine Tree State. Good book. Yeah. Siege at the State House, which tells the true story of a several-month occupation of the Augusta State House in 1879, based on charges of election fraud. It was only settled by the good judgment of retired Civil War General Joshua Chamberlain and the patience of the Maine people. And then lastly, disaster at the Bar Harbor Ferry, which was mentioned earlier, Maine's worst maritime tragedy. Some say that the loss of the Portland back in the 1800s was a worse tragedy, and that's true, but it was never pinpointed where that ship went down. So I think that's why we're claiming this to be Maine's worst maritime tragedy. With that, I am going to turn it over to see if anybody has any questions that I'd love to answer.
Thanks, Mac. This is fascinating. How about you start off? Can you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in the Titanic and the main story in particular?
Sure. I had 4 older brothers, and just growing up, somehow we had a book about Titanic, and I remember my brothers telling me of the rule of women and children first, and something captivated my interest in there being an automatic rule like that, and it got me looking into Titanic a little bit more. It wasn't until the 1997 movie came out that my interest was drawn again, but I remembered that childhood fascination. I liked Maine history. I liked Titanic, and I thought, wouldn't it be neat if there was some sort of book that could come out of that interest? When I did just a preliminary research of the first few weeks after Titanic sinking, I found a number of these stories that I told you about, these people. And I quickly found that there was more than enough information for a good book on the subject. And as I said, I'm thrilled to be able to preserve some of this Maine history that is getting lost to time. And I found a nice little niche with Down East Books, writing about obscure little corners of Maine history. It's why I stick with Down East, because they allow that. Who else would publish Mainers on the Titanic? So that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you. And now someone has a question, which is kind of what I was wondering as well. Where you found most of these stories, specifically, where did you do your research?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. What I did was I went up to Fogler Library up at University of Maine at Orono. And as you know, as you may know, they have quite a nice collection of Maine newspapers on microfilm. Now, back in this time period, most every small Maine town had a newspaper. So what I did was I searched from April 15th actually up until May 31st. And I looked at the bigger papers. From there, I looked at the smaller papers. And that's where I found the names and the stories. And from there, I was able to research other sources, generalize or make it more specific. I will say I never did make it to the Penobscot Marine Museum for that research, but years ago I utilized that excellent resource for some genealogical research for the family that built the house that I live in now, the Black family, and I was quite impressed with what they have there. So, but no, Fogler Library and looking at those old newspapers to me was like a time machine, took me right back in time. Those stories were detailed. And what you'll find in my book is details and quotes, because the facts kind of give you the skeleton of a story, but it's those details and quotes. And I spent a lot of time researching, and it paid off.
And this particular audience member was the practice manager for the Eleanor Widner Dixon Clinic for many years, and they're wondering if you can elaborate on that family a bit more.
I'd love to. The Widners, they were from Philadelphia. They would come here every summer. They had been coming here for, oh golly, yeah. The first time the Widners came, Philadelphia was always heavily represented in Bar Harbor. The first time they came for an official extended visit, they came aboard the Josephine, named after the family matriarch. Everybody in Bar Harbor was thrilled. The Josephine weighs anchor, and that night, the matriarch Josephine died on the yacht of a heart attack, basically. And instead of a week of gaiety, they had to put up black mourning flags, and the Josephine leaves Frenchman Bay. Now, the Widners do continue to come back after that very tragic start. I can't remember all the specifics of them, but they were around Winter Harbor, Bar Harbor. Eleanor, and it was Eleanor and I think George Widner were aboard Titanic. Eleanor was buying a trousseau for her daughter, Eleanor Widner Dixon's wedding to Mr. Dixon. And that was one of the things she had done in Europe. They come back, young Eleanor marries Mr. Dixon, and the Dixon family and the Widner family continues to summer on Mount Desert Island and basically in Bar Harbor for years after that, if I'm remembering correctly. And I only mentioned a few of the charitable contributions made by that family. I've had people say, the people on Bar Harbor weren't Mainers. They were. Their imprint is down there, helping us Mainers still today, even though the family's been gone for a few generations. A lot more details in the book. I just can't remember them all right now.
Thank you. And Mac and I were talking about this before the program, but all of these books are available at your local bookstores, and we encourage you to support them. And they are also available on like Amazon and national places as well. So again, if you have any questions, go ahead and type those in the chat box. But perhaps, Mac, do you have a new project that you're working on now?
Well, one reason I've been talking so much about Madeline Astor is one thing I discovered in putting together Mainers on the Titanic was her story was a book unto itself. And I had to whittle down her story to make it fit into the confines of the Titanic story. And I gave her short shrift for the person that she was, the multifaceted person that she was. So I'm having this golden opportunity to revisit her, answer some of the questions that came up in my mind when I researched her initially. Now I have an excuse to research her. The editor at Down East is already on board with it. And again, I go back in time. Every time I look at an old newspaper, I see the men with their walking sticks and their big hats, and the women with their big hats. And of course, I probably am romanticizing things horribly, but that's how I am. Yeah.
Well, that's exciting. We look forward to hearing more about her.
Thank you.
It looks like our audience doesn't really have questions. Perhaps, do you have some final remarks about the Titanic?
Sure, I'd love to. As I said, it's so hard to fit everything or the essence even of the book sometimes into a short period. So again, it's very detailed, a lot of quotes, and just a lot of interesting aspects. One of the interesting things were advertisements in the Maine newspapers after Titanic sank. And there were a few companies that were quite reputable and a few that are still in business now, including life insurance companies that traded on the loss of Titanic. It was very sad, but those are some of the details that are in the book. And what I found, those are what I found in looking through all those newspapers. There's a chapter about the people of Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the bodies that were recovered were brought to. And that chapter will bring you to tears. It should. I can't think of it without it. The people of Halifax were very good to the people of Maine that went up there, and the people, everybody from the country that went up there to retrieve their loved ones or just look for their loved ones. Just a great chapter there, inspiring in its own way. There's just a lot of things like that in there, and I do wish I could go into more details on every single thing. It does kind of give it short shrift. I just hope you'll take a chance, go to your local library, go to a bookstore, go to Down East online there, and just have a chance and maybe thumb through it and look through it and give it a chance is all I'm asking. Don't even buy it, just give it a chance. And yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mac. And thank you everybody who chose to come out and listen to Mainers on the Titanic tonight. And we hope to see you back again to find out about fog on the Maine coast and in the photo archives in the next few weeks. And I guess we'll close it out for the night.
Thank you everybody for being here.